I should be worried. I'll just stand in front of the door.
I used to have a professor who hated when people were going late or early, so he was locking the door.
We locked the door.
You couldn't. So no one could get in, no one could get out.
That's lovely.
And actually, it made all the students who were in
Yeah, well,
come on time.
of course. If, at least somebody is sitting on that side. Should anybody introduce or shall I just start? It is a... Yeah, there's a microphone, right? So if you want to say something, you will need to come very close. Hello. Which is... Yeah, I think it works better. Yeah. I'm so welcome. I'm so... Yeah, let's not push it too far. So we stop at... Help me out. It was 11, right? So Philip, no. In an hour, can you start waving at me? In 1 hour.
In 1 hour, yeah.
If we get stereo, then it's...
Yeah. Half past 10.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then I'll start wrapping up so that we can have like 2 seconds of discussion, or people can leave early or cry or whatever. Okay, just check. Okay. I shall whisper from now on. Okay, let's start. Welcome to this welcome lecture. I was sort of practicing this first sentences because it actually sounds really nice. It's good to be here, and I do feel welcome. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to also do what academics do and have a lecture to introduce some of the stuff that more recently I've been working with. Which is captured by the title that you see behind me, referring to visual sociology. And I have to, before I start talking about visual sociology and the use of images and different kinds of repertoires, communicative repertoires, I need to make a little detour, because I have to say something about writing. In academia, we write. We write endlessly. One of the basic ways of learning and teaching in academia is through the written text. It's totally central to academia. There's 100 years of history in writing as the main communicative tool. Nothing against that, by the way, and I will repeat this. But the written text is one of our key instruments. And if you start looking at how much we actually do, how much we write, it's quite spectacular. If you look at the number of publications that come out of academia, and this is just one report focusing on STM, if we look at the publication outlets, that report mentions more than 28,000 journals, English language, when they were doing the count 2014. And that only covers the English language. So there are obviously still, luckily, many different other languages also being used for publishing. But in that count for the 28,000, they arrived at 2.5 million articles per year. So we sort of write. We write a lot. And then, of course, you could ask yourself, yeah, do we read what is then written? Because one of the more cynical comments in academia is, of course, you can write, and then if you're lucky, one person, usually the reviewer, will actually read your article. If you're really lucky, if you're unlucky, then even the reviewer won't read it properly, which also happens. But one of these cliches in academia is nobody reads, which is not entirely true. And again, there is some research there, and then we have to use some sort of a shortcut, because of course it's extremely difficult to start measuring reading behavior. But what we do know quite a lot about is downloading behavior, right? The downloads of academic texts. And again, an old study, but still quite relevant, of pediatrics, one of the journals, and there the average download for articles from pediatrics was 14,000 and a half. Which doesn't mean that there were 14,000 readers, but it does express some interest also in the reading of what we write. And if you look at the other data, other surveys, we go into the hundreds of millions of downloads. And again, we store them on our computers, and sometimes we don't even look at them, but in a number of cases people will read. And it does, in a way, deconstruct the myth that we don't read. Also, as readers, the written text is quite important, I would argue. Now, there's one little thing about academic writing that I also want to emphasize, and that's the pain of creativity. Right? That's how writing often feels. I think we can all identify with her. She's clearly writing, right? She's having this little crisis moment, but then she will start writing again, I'm sure. This kind of academic writing is not that easy. It takes effort, it takes time, it takes a lot of hassle. You have to go also to the procedures of academic publishing, where you submit to journals or to editors of books, to publishers, and where you're being evaluated and in many cases rejected. And that also creates this kind of response. I think everybody that has received a review for the very first time or for the 100th time also feels like that. It's quite normal. So there is some pain in the creativity of writing, but we still commit, maybe slightly masochistically, to the written text. It is absolutely vital, not just to academics, scholars, but also to students. And we force students to write papers in quite a number of cases. There is the thesis, which really matters as a pedagogical instrument. It all matters tremendously. And what I do want to emphasize, that I do love books, and I do love writing. It matters also to me. So whatever I'm going to talk about next, it's not going to discredit this idea. It's what I do want to talk about is how we can complement academic writing with other repertoires, other ways of communicating. But I don't want to talk about books in any bad way, and in particular books. I think we need to publish more books and not only articles, but that's a little footnote. It does matter tremendously, also in how we learn, how we acquire knowledge, in other words, and how we communicate that knowledge to others. And it is a vital tool. But I would argue we can use other tools. And one of these other tools that I've been fortunate to use is the camera, both a film camera and photography, as one of these alternative communicative tools to communicate academic knowledge. Now this is, I'm not talking about holiday snapshots. They're important and we all love them, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not even talking about the pure artistic work, which is also quite interesting, obviously. But what I want to talk about is the use of these technologies to communicate academic knowledge, to translate what we do into vehicles of communication that we can then expose audiences to. And that transfer of academic knowledge is what I'm interested in. And of course, I'm not the first to make this point. It's actually quite old, and some have called it the artistic turn in social sciences and humanities. Well, there have been many turns: linguistic turn, cultural turn, demotic turn, political turn, and I think if I do a little survey, each of you can at least come up with 5 other turns. we've had so many turns that we're quite dizzy by now, because we've all been sort of reorienting ourselves to accommodate these different turns. But there is something that is called the artistic turn in social sciences and the humanities, which means a turn to the arts as one of the areas of research. And there I have to go into a little anecdote. At some point in Brussels University, I was involved in what was called the Platform in the Arts. And the Platform in the Arts was an attempt of a collaboration between different universities and different artistic schools, polytechnics in many cases, to establish a PhD, a practice-based PhD in the arts. Brilliant idea. So I find myself in the room sitting with arts teachers, arts professors, and artists. And they said, we want to do a PhD, basically also because there was an obligation for teachers in the arts to what they called professionalize, which was a horrible word, but it meant to have a PhD. So that was created, but then the issue is, what is an artistic PhD or a practice-based PhD in the arts? Yes, you'll have to run. It's okay. And that question then became part of the discussions. What is academic research? That's fine, but what is artistic research? Because the artists, all the different people in the... I think you're doing this way too quietly. So what they were saying is, well, we should do research, but we should do artistic research. And what we do as artists, and that was a step that was really interesting, what we do as artists is research, which was quite an eye-opener and quite a bit of a shock for me, because, of course, being totally socialized in academia, I was saying, no, academics do research. Of course, I knew that this was untrue, but almost unconsciously, you were very, very keen on protecting this idea, academic research is research and research is academic research. But, of course, NGOs do research, and they often do really good research, but artists also do research. And that idea, the idea of artistic research, became quite important. And once you start looking for the actual publications on artistic research, you will find a lot. And it's not just arts historians that are doing research into the history of the arts, which is a traditional academic approach. It's also artists doing research while they are generating their art. And that is a key idea of this artistic turn. That is one big idea. That was then later on transformed into what is called arts-based practice or arts-based research. The idea that you can actually do research through the arts, where the artistic practice itself becomes a way of generating knowledge. That's arts-based research. It's the idea that once you start organizing artistic practices, you not only transfer knowledge, which comes out of artistic research, but you also generate it through the process itself. And that's what's called arts-based research. And one of the classics is Patricia Levy's book, Method Meets Art, and this comes from that idea. And her argument is quite radical. She argues that there is a third paradigm, which is arts-based research. We have, of course, and I think as scholars, we know the quantitative and the qualitative paradigms quite well. The quantitative with its emphasis on generalizability, on validity, on reliability, but the qualitative dimension with its approach in its emphasis on interpretation and transferability as key notions. To put it really simple, measurement versus meaning. And we tend to see that quite often as dichotomies, which is sort of also not really true. Now, Levy's argument is that there's a third paradigm. I'm not sure if I follow her entirely, but the argument she makes for the difference is quite compelling. What she argues is that arts-based research is interested in authenticity, and most importantly, in resonance. It allows you to feel knowledge, which is quite unique. And we don't think about knowledge as something that is connected to affect when we produce it. And we definitely don't look at knowledge as something which is affect-based. when we start communicating, writing our articles, apart from the pain of creativity that I talked about before, possibly. But this argument is, you can feel knowledge. It resonates with the audience, with the readers, with the visitors, the ones that are exposed to it. And it's not about measurement or meaning, it's about evocation as a key idea of what is being communicated. The knowledge is evoked and not necessarily about meaning or measurement. And that idea is useful to start thinking about how to communicate academic knowledge. Right? Can we indeed use the idea of resonance when we are communicating with our audiences and transferring our knowledge? Her argument actually pushes it quite far, and I always come with a question for PhD students that are exposed to this slide. And the question is, can you dance your PhD? It's an interesting question. And I think a number of people would say, oh my God, no. Please, no, don't make me do this, and don't expose the audience to that. Probably the second is an even better reason, not always to try. But some would say, of course I can. And can you sing? Right? Can you produce music that communicates that knowledge? Can you use poetry? Can you use narrative fiction to communicate your knowledge? That's the question she actually answers in this book. And of course, some of the methods she talks about are much closer to us. The work in the visual arts, documentary filmmaking, we've actually been using that quite extensively to communicate. But we, in many cases in communication and media studies, we've never talked about this in terms of using arts-based repertoires to communicate our knowledge. We just did a film. But this point Levy makes is that it's integrated in a broader approach, which is called the arts-based research approach, or paradigm as she calls it. And I found this quite interesting also in looking for examples. This is a PhD from Columbia University, which is probably not the least of universities in the world. It's called Unflattering. It was successfully defended, so it is an authentic, real PhD. And it's a comic book. It uses the repertoire of the comic to communicate what I would probably describe as a philosophical debate. And then one time somebody asked me, is there no text? Well, of course, in a comic book there is text, but it's the little balloons that float around and that actually contain still written text. But it's the genre of the comic book, right, that is being used. Now, I'm not sure if we should all start drawing comic books, that's not my point, but I think these are ways of rethinking what we do in producing and communicating academic knowledge. And now the narcissistic part starts. Some of the things that I've been doing with these ideas. I'm not arguing that this is purely arts-based research, but it was very much inspired by arts-based research. I'm not arguing that these are perfect examples, but they are still using more artistic tools to communicate academic knowledge. And Respublica is the best example I can give you. Respublica was, as you can see in the title, a Cypriot community media arts festival. Sounds great. It actually came out of a book, a traditionally written academic book on Cyprus, the Cyprus problem and the role of community media in Cyprus in relationship to conflict transformation. It's a lovely 400 pages book, which makes people suffer if they read it, obviously, because it's a bit abstract, at least in the beginning. But when the book was finished, you, as author, you're faced with the question, what shall I do next? Shall I just go to conferences and talk about it? Shall I put it on the ECRIA mailing list, which of course I did, and I did organize all these talks. That was sort of natural. But that was too obvious at that stage. Also because the book was very, very informed by participatory theory, but also by participatory practice. I was working and studying on a community media broadcaster, CCMC, the Cyprus Community Media Center. And that was a participatory organization. But the research itself was also participatory in the sense that I trained some of the collaborators of the CCMC to do the research on themselves, right? Where you move away from the position of studying them as objects, but where you integrate them as subjects into the research itself, which is one of the participatory methodologies captured, for instance, in participatory action research and these methods. So it was already a very participatory setup, and that then raised the question, should I just organize unidirectional communication about the book, or should I do something that is more participatory, that involves the CCMC people in also communicating about this research? And we did involve them, and I did involve them in, say, more traditional types of communication about the research, because it was also relevant for them. But then this idea came up, also partially because one of the arts galleries in Cyprus expressed an interest in having this exhibition with them, this project with them, NIM, a Limassol-based NGO Cyprus. So they expressed an interest. The idea of Respublica was quite simple. Instead of me talking about my own book, I would organize a platform where community media activists could talk about community media and the importance of community media for democracy and conflict transformation, which was basically what the book was about in the first place. But instead of me talking about them, they could talk about themselves on a platform that I created for them. So we came up with this label, Community Media Affiliated Artists, because we wanted to use artistic repertoires to have them communicate about themselves. Behind that was the idea, that's not very well documented, behind that was the idea that community media activists are actually extremely creative people. We often forget that. Also, if you read all the literature on community media, participatory media, you would see that one thing is emphasized. It's important for democracy. What is not emphasized is the creative, artistic dimension of their work. There's a lot of emphasis on radio art, for instance, in the field of community media. So they do a lot of creative things, but they don't always label themselves artists. So they don't take the artist identity, so to speak. They take an activist identity and a broadcaster, alternative broadcaster identity, but they don't take the artist identity, even if the creative practice is there. And I wanted to tap not only in their democratic potential, their reservoir of knowledge about participation, but I also wanted to tap into their creative artistic capacities that they also had. And that's why the notion of community media affiliated artists was used. One of the problems was that they themselves would not agree with the label. If I would talk to them, we organized a lot of workshops to train them and to sort of motivate them to engage in this project, obviously. And then when I said, but you're an artist, they were like, I'm not. Don't call me an artist. I'm a community media broadcaster, at best. In some cases, they would even say, I'm just a broadcaster. I'm just doing alternative stuff. They wouldn't even use the label community media. But slowly but surely, a number of people did get interested in this project, and we had quite a number of applications. We also launched an international call so that people from other countries involved in community media production would also be part of this, so that we wouldn't have a very Cypriot-based, but much more of an international and Cypriot-based project. And then it got completely out of hand. It virtually killed me because it got a bit too ambitious. These things happen. And so what we ended up was 3 exhibitions. One exhibition is already quite a lot of work. 3 exhibitions is lethal. And in addition to that, we combined the exhibitions with one festival week, which was running in parallel with the opening. And the idea there was that we wouldn't want to only expose the material in the white cube of a gallery. Right? You know, the art galleries, they look like white cubes. Right? They have white walls and they look like a big box. And we also wanted to move outside the white cube. moving into the cities, in particular in Nicosia and Limassol, where we were using a lot of the squares for the festival activities, where different artists were also working in the more public spaces and not just in the very confined space of the gallery, which is again very much part of this participatory outreach, talking about different people and exposing different people, not just in the gallery. So that was the festival with 17 events. And then we had the seminar series. We invited a number of speakers, mostly to the gallery, so that they would also contextualize a lot of the stuff that we were talking about through these artistic repertoires. The 3 exhibitions were quite interesting. Let me see, there's this little materia thing there, which was a small exhibition. And this was one project in particular that was extremely fascinating. It was a group, British documentary filmmakers, academics, and people that were dealing with a terminal illness that together produced videos about, not them dying, but about them living. Actually offering different representations of what it means to have a terminal illness. And there were 6 brilliant videos. Really nice. One of the participants died during the recording, so one of them is actually not very visible in the living sense. These things happen. But the 6 videos were there, and we didn't want to only broadcast them or show them in a gallery. We actually took them to a hospice. And so we claimed in Cypriot Nicosia hospice materia, we claimed a little space there where we built the exhibition. And that was actually a consultation room that was still being used, which was, I did the setup myself there. It was quite fascinating because I ended up sitting in the same room as a doctor having a consultation discussion with the patient while I was building the exhibition in that room, which was a bit strange for everybody involved, I can assure you. But eventually we created that space so that people visiting the hospice, but also people staying there, and more importantly, people working there, could see the exhibition. And we did a workshop together with the artists to discuss the exhibition with the staff working in the hospice. So that was the kind of stuff we were doing there. But the 2 big exhibitions, one was with Jad en Wachter, which are actually fairly famous artists that deal with digital activism. They were very active in, for instance, the Gezi Park protests in Turkey, where they were allowing the activists that were sort of having a fight with the Turkish riot police, allowing them to communicate with each other. As an arts project, they built the Wi-Fi network that allowed these activists to talk to each other. They also documented that process, and that became part of one of the installations at their exhibition. And what you actually see, I don't know if you recognize the image on top. You recognize the cans, right? Sort of a weird construction with tin cans. That's a wireless antenna. That's how they build their antennas, and they actually work. But they also did a workshop there at the exhibition with Cypriot activists, teaching them how to build these antennas themselves so that they could use the technology for their own purposes. That was one exhibition, so it was very much a solo exhibition, but the big exhibition was Participation Matters, which had 18 art projects included, and we were mostly using, but not exclusively, using the gallery for that. And it looked a bit like this. There were 2 floors. This is the top floor. The entrance is at the back. The Respublika logo you can see at the entrance, and then you see different installations. And just to give you one example, it was one of my favorites. This was a series of photographs made by a Cypriot photography collective affiliated to a Nicosia broadcaster. And what they normally did, they're called Old Nicosia Revealed, they go into the city center and they take pictures of the buffer zone, which is in Nicosia the center of the city. It's a walled city, the city is divided into 2. And they actually do a lot of work in the buffer zone in the center of Nicosia, but also showing the beauty of that old town center of Nicosia. They're very much interested in this wall. I mean, think Berlin Wall, but a bit less sophisticated and sort of collapsing a bit. That's the Nicosia Wall. And they're very interested in photography in relationship to that wall. Now, what they then did in this project was to take these pictures of these walls. You're still with me? No, you have to pay attention for a second. Take the pictures of these walls and put them in other places and take pictures of these pictures. Right? So the referential logics. But the idea was, and that's very important in Cyprus, you can move a wall, right? Which is a political statement in its own right. But they also brought them to other places where the wall actually had a different function, where the wall became something else, which again in a Cypriot context is extremely important. This reconfiguration of a divide showing that there's actually hope of moving, displacing walls and reconfiguring, resignifying walls. That was their project. And I think it was one of the brilliant projects where a number of people actually collaborated. So at one point I took a number of these photos, these original walls, I took them with me to Portugal, and I was working with a group of Portuguese photography students in a Portuguese city called Viseu, and actually putting them on the walls there of a walled city in Portugal. Again, resignifying the meaning of and moving these walls. But let me stop talking for a second. I think you need a little break, at least from me. I'll show you the video. It's a very documentary video in the sense, not even in the good word of the documentary, it's an archival video. So it basically does nothing but to show you how it looked like. It's like a visit. Now, any kind of film is necessarily hopeless, right? An exhibition is a format in itself, and it actually requires your physical presence. A film can never replicate that experience of visiting an exhibition, but it can sort of give you a vague idea. And I'll show you that. I just should add that there were two levels. So this is the main level, and then we had the basement level. We built a cinema in the basement level on that side. And as any scholar knows, it's always too tempting just to curate the work of others. I also wanted to do something myself. And one of the things I did was in the basement underneath this floor was to build an installation which is called the Mirror Palace of Democracy, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let me try, if the technology assists us in this difficult enterprise, let me try to give you some sort of a view. It's short, be assured. So there are two levels, right? You got that. So that's the old Nicosia revealed, meet your wall that I just described. This was our little cinema. Okay, so I can talk about each of these art projects endlessly, and I don't want to keep you here forever. Let's try a participatory strategy. Is there any of the art projects you want me to talk about? Yeah.
I would love to talk about the dress.
Yeah, the uniform. Yeah, this was a brilliant project. It was a young Cypriot artist that, George Kiriou, the starting point was that this was a critique on the militarization of the island. There are something like 7 armies on Cyprus, so it's a highly militarized environment, which means there are lots of uniforms there, obviously. There's the Greek army, the Turkish army, the Cypriot National Guard, the Turkish Cypriot police forces, armed forces. There's the British army, there are the UN peacekeepers, nothing but uniforms. So what he said is like, I'm going to reconfigure the uniform and I'm going to re-signify the idea of the uniform. So he organized a series of workshops where people could bring their uniforms. A lot of them are in the reserve, so they have all the uniforms. They brought them to the workshops and they would cut them up and reconstruct them, combining the different uniforms from all over the island into something which was not a uniform, a dress. And it was a gorgeous sort of long skirted dress. They made a number of other dresses, but one dress was so beautiful that we displayed it in full in the gallery. And this was actually one of these critiques on militarism. It's not very legal to cut up uniforms. You're not supposed to do that there. But hey. So it's, no, that was a really nice one. So, and it was very much part of Cyprus in that sense, and the Cyprus problem critiques. Any, yeah?
And the one of that wolf howling.
Oh yeah, that was a bit of a strange one. It was a brilliant one, I really loved it. It was literally about howling. So these were 2 Slovene artists linked to the Slovene alternative media scene. And they produced howling recordings, sound recordings, but also video recordings. So literally, they send in a video of a group of people standing in the Ljubljana snow, all howling together like wolves. Now, behind that they were radio people. Behind that was a fascination with communication and how wolves use communication not only to reach out to the others, but also to demarcate the territory, which was very much part of the reflection on Cyprus again, because it's all about territory there and how communication is used to demarcate. So what they then did, and what we did, was to use the idea and get a group of locals to organize another howling session in the buffer zone itself. So one of the pictures where you see them at work was in the Cypriot buffer zone, a demilitarized militarized zone, where they were all howling together, which was a very strange sound and sight. But that was, again, the same reflection about the territory and the connection between communication and territory. So it was a brilliant video, and we were a bit sort of worried about that project because the buffer zone is sort of guarded and there's police and UN police. And we had no idea what it was going to produce if people just started howling there. Quite loud, actually. So that was okay, but the complexity was that in Cyprus, wolf has a different meaning. It also has a political meaning, because the radical right-wing Turkish are called grey wolves. So we were sort of thinking maybe this is sort of a complication, but it worked out fine, and we didn't meet any real grey wolves there, luckily. No, that was also a nice one. Anyway, so thanks for the input. I could, as I said, I could talk about, no. I could talk about all of them endlessly. There were many fascinating projects. But I sort of want to talk about the one that I produced myself, which is called the Mirror Palace of Democracy. Now I should check with you. Do you know what a mirror palace is? Oh, could I ask you to explain it?
Like the mirror labyrinth?
A labyrinth, indeed. It's usually, you'll find it in a carnivalesque, fancy fair kind of setting where kids, They storm in, they bounce around, crash into the walls, hurt themselves because they can't see the mirrors, the glass plates. And the idea is you go through the labyrinth with the mirrors, some of them deforming you, and then when you come out, you sort of feel happy and joyful. Yeah. Mostly because you made it out, right?
And the distortion is important.
And the distortion is very much part of the fun, you know, of that. So I used that idea of the mirror palace, and we built one. We built one in the basement of that arts gallery, which I actually can show you. This is us building it. My name, my surname is Carpentier, right? Carpenter. I had my own carpenter there, so I was working with him to build that space. Now, the idea of the mirror palace, it was the mirror palace of democracy. The big point was that democracy is a maze, but it was a political theoretical reflection on democracy and how democracy is always, in a way, dependent on different ideological projects to give meaning to it. So what I did was that, and you might recognize one of the people I victimized for the videos. What I did was I made 5 videos. They all look like this, so these are the 5. Sort of front, people speaking to the camera. Each of them defended an ideological project. They all started by saying, I am the people. And the project, the ideological project they would then try to convince the visitor of was either a liberal, a nationalist, an authoritarian, a solidarist project. So we had 5 of these voices in the mirror palace, with the mirrors reflecting. It became, and that was the intention, cacophonic. You were bombarded with these voices. And I'll show a video, which is extremely difficult to capture this idea, but I'll show you a video of this cacophonic sound with 2 of the actors we were using. These, by the way, were 2 professional actors from the Uppsala City Theatre in Sweden. So I was actually directing them, which was also quite a unique experience in doing the video. But then we also used 3 scholars via a Swedish colleague, Annika, and Gary Gumpert. Don't know if you recognize him. It's actually American communication studies scholar working on urban communication. Now the idea was that you went into the labyrinth and you were exposed to that cacophonic combination of voices. But at the same time, because of the reflections, these ideologies became endless. Right? So they were copied all over. And because you were there as a visitor, it got inscribed on your body. The theoretical point is that ideology actually works on your body. It's not only the mind that it tries to convince, it is actually also the body that is integrated in this assemblage of democracy. There was sort of a bit of a technical problem because I was half-jokingly referring to the idea that kids, when they go into the mirror palaces, they really hurt themselves banging into. This actually also happened because when we were building it, and it was just finished, one of the coordinators of the arts center, of course, crashed into one of the glass panels, banging her nose. Now, I had already prepared something for that because I knew it was going to happen, and I was trying to prevent it, but that was too late. So I had brought a sign saying, running into the walls of democracy can be painful. And I put the sign at exactly the spot where she crashed into the glass plate, so that at least nobody else would do it. But she could see the humor of that move as well, so we were fine. But it is actually also part of the installation. Running into the walls of democracy is painful. It is restrictive. It is part of the logics of democracy itself. Now, going back to arts-based research, one of the ideas of arts-based research is that the production of the artwork itself generates knowledge. It's not only about communicating ideas, it's also about developing new ideas. What came out of this installation for me was the idea that, well, you build a mirror palace, which is a physical space, and you call that democracy, and then the question is, what is outside democracy? What do you do with the spaces outside? How do you enter the palace, and how do you leave the palace? translated as how do you enter democracy and how do you leave democracy? What happens if you leave democracy? When we produced a film about the Mirror Palace more in detail, there is a longer film about it. At the end, the camera actually leaves the palace, but it fades to white. The moment you leave, it goes into not a black screen, but a white screen. Which is sort of my way of communicating that maybe if we leave democracy, we could find, if we're really lucky, we could find something better. But of course, there is a darker analysis that if you leave democracy, if you leave the Mirror Palace, you'll end up in a very dark space, an authoritarian space. Right? And that discussion was actually, for me, quite helpful. But let me screen it.
I am the people, and we are all free human beings.
I am
To respect, protect, and treat people.
I am you. Even if we have If you have pain, I will feel your pain. If you need food, I will feed you, knowing that if I'm hungry, you will feed me. And if you laugh, I will join you in laughter. We are all humans, and we need to take care of each other.
We belong together.
Love each other.
We are brothers
And not
and sisters.
each other.
We are entitled to rule ourselves. Besides, what we do ourselves, we do best.
These were two ideological projects. The last one was a nationalist one. The first, you heard the female voice, that's a solidarist ideological project. The idea is that democracy is actually the struggle between these different voices for hegemony, right? To actually control democracy, to control the palace. And you could maybe see that I really did my best not to film myself, but failed. It is extremely difficult to film, and we were working with different people trying to capture the idea of the Mirror Palace on film, which actually doesn't work. You have to be there, you have to be exposed to this kind of environment to understand it for real, but anyway. The second example I want to talk about, a bit shorter, is again a Cypriot example. Actually three exhibitions. One basic idea, Iconoclastic Controversies, it was called. One was in Nicosia, in the buffer zone. The second was in Limassol, in the Arts Gallery Nîmes. But the third went to Brasilia, in collaboration with the University of Brasilia. And just for the record, I designed sort of the basic poster, but I did not put my picture there. I actually don't like it, but they really insisted. And then put it all over the campus, like they had 500 flyers and prints, and so when I was there, it was sort of looking into the mirror kind of experience, which was a bit awkward. But anyway, the idea of iconoclastic controversies is in itself quite simple. If we think about conflict, we think about conflict not just through our memories, but we also memorialize. We build ways of remembering, statues, commemoration sites. These commemoration sites themselves are political. They are locations to hegemonize particular ways of thinking about conflict. But they are also contested. There are other, in some cases, interpretations that no longer call the person a hero, but a war criminal, and demand for the removal of the statue, for instance. Or there are other statutes that are not so much celebrating the logics of war, but that are celebrating the logics of peace. Now, they're very, very rare. They do exist. This was a research project looking at the south of Cyprus, trying to understand the logics of memorialization, how the Cypriot statutes actually provided ways of thinking about the Cyprus conflict, and in particular, the Greek Cypriot role, position in that conflict. And it's, of course, no surprise that the dominant outcome was a glorification of war. I was looking at two conflicts, the Independence War from the 1950s and the way it was memorialized, and 1974, which was the moment of the Turkish invasion, where basically about 1/3 of the island became controlled by Turkey, which for the Greek Cypriots was a tremendous trauma. It was a huge loss. Also because a lot of people that were living in the north were removed from their houses and had to literally became displaced persons on their island itself and had to start living and building a life somewhere else in the south. Very, very traumatizing elements, but you do find the glorification, a very traditional discourse on conflict, the glorification of the self, the sacrifice of the self, and this is one of the part of a photo of a memorial of the mother, which of course often symbolizes the nation, the mother that is actually carrying on her back the flame, the torch of freedom. And it's her sacrifice that has kept freedom alive. Even if, this is a 1974 reference, even if, of course, the Greek Cypriot army was defeated completely. But it is still this moment of sacrifice combined with the reasons for sacrifice, protection of freedom, protection of the nation, etc. And of course it's about the son she lost, or the husband she lost, or the brother or sister she lost. So this is very much the way that on Cyprus the conflict is memorialized. And that was transformed into a series of photo exhibitions. This is actually the first one. This was in the buffer zone itself, and remember the howling video that was actually recorded here. So the Cypriot howling was there. This is the home for cooperation, which is sort of a neutral space where Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots meet, and other communities living on the island, also to organize collaborations. It's a very activist, peace movement-driven space. But it's very much in the buffer zone, and if you look very, very carefully, you'll see this. Any idea? Anybody wants to have a little guess?
We have memory.
Yeah. Well, you can't see the letters, right? But if you know, this is UN. It's a typically white UN watchtower. And it's built there because that is used by UN, and was used and could still be used by UN peacekeepers to actually keep an eye on the Turkish side of the buffer zone, where the checkpoints are and where Turkish military and Turkish Cypriot police are. So it's very much part of that buffer zone, and that's where the first exhibition took place. This is the second one in the gallery in Limassol, where we also organized some of the listening posts where people could listen to recordings that we had made. And again, the same idea really mattered. It was about communicating an analysis of memorialization logics and using photography to communicate that analysis. And for instance, this is one of the photos of one of the heroes, the fallen heroes of the Greek Cypriots, Afkensiou, who was in the mid-50s burned alive by British soldiers. Well, he met a very unpleasant ending, but he was the second in command of EOKA, the guerrilla movement that eventually achieved independence for Cyprus, even if they desperately wanted to join Greece. So that photograph of that hero, and you'll find that hero everywhere, the statues are all over the south of Cyprus. There are lots of street names that refer to Afkensiou, so that it is one of the key heroes. But the picture is actually made in such a way that it's trying to reach out for that Greek flag, which was what EOKA wanted, what the guerrilla movement wanted. Not independence, but enosis, joining Greece. That was frustrating. So this picture is actually called Out of Reach, and was part of an analysis of how these representation logics functioned in the very dominant hegemonic way. Now, Afkensiou is quite often portrayed with a machine gun, so you'll find the classic military hero being used quite a lot. Ready for the next video? So we took the exhibition to Brasilia, capital of Brazil, And yeah, I should add that this was a huge gallery. It was actually a bit too big for the exhibition. So what I decided to do was to build a tower in the middle of the gallery to break up the large space and to, in a way, evoke, remember the logics of evocation I was talking about before, to evoke a wall in the gallery itself. So we were actually building this, and I still have scars on my arms because it's actually not that easy to build these kinds of installations yourself. But we built this little tower, put the barbed wire on top of it, and used that to display some of the pictures related to actually the Cyprus wall, to the buffer zone, and to the segregation of the island in '74. And for those who are interested in the music, it's Brazilian dubstep. So we'll have a little detour. And of course it's in Portuguese, right? I used is actually called More Peace and Bass. So it was quite appropriate. The statue you saw, the head you saw at the end, that was Grifas, who was the leader of the Greek Cypriot uprising in the 1950s. And I took a statue, sort of like a head statue, with me to Brasilia, which was already quite awkward because it's quite heavy. But when I went there, I had no idea what to do with him because Grifas is a fairly dubious figure. He's on the one hand seen as the leader of the independence movement that brought eventually independence to the island. But he also played a key role in creating and feeding the Cyprus problem. For instance, with having EOKA, the resistance movement, also attack Turkish Cypriots. And later in the 70s, he played a vital role in the coup and in preparing the grounds for the coup against the president, the Cypriot president. So he has a very dubious role. So I put him, I found in the gallery, I found a little cage, a metal cage. So I put him there. So he was in prison, in a way, which I thought was actually quite appropriate for placing him in that exhibition. Yes. Good. They were warning me about the time. No. But let me wrap up and let me offer you a few quick reflections about especially the last project. Art-based research is also about learning, about the artistic practice itself, but also through the artistic practice itself. And so there were quite a number of interesting problems. In a way, I wanted to move away from a linear narrative, right? Move away from the written text, which is ultimately linear. You can play a bit with textual experiments, but it forces you in a linear way of writing and thinking. And I wanted to move away from that. But then when I started building the exhibition, I found myself actually working with chapters and a linear narrative. So in a way, the written text had its revenge on me in these first exhibitions, because they literally forced me, almost forced me into creating a text, a written text with its chapters and its particular steps you had to go through. In the later version, in the third version, I became more aware of that, and I was still using chapter logics. So there were, for instance, analysis of 1974 and the hegemonic discourse, the way that statutes were representing a conflict in this logics of war. But I didn't have a very clear beginning of the exhibition. I didn't want to have that. I did have a little note here, which says sort of the exhibition starts here. And then my Brazilian colleagues were telling me the note is too small. Nobody would see it. And then I was saying that's the intention. It should be small. It should be just an indication that people should be free to walk the exhibition in the way they want to walk it, moving away from this logics of linearity. And of course, behind that, mille plateaux, 1,000 plateaus, the idea of Deleuze and Guattari that you can enter a book from different angles. Well, you can enter an exhibition from different angles. Maybe 1,000 platforms, 1,000 entry points is a bit too much, maybe a few, but still moving away from this unidirectional, linear way of entering through text, but also through exhibitions is quite important. Second element that came out of this project, of course, context matters. And if you work with photography, especially with historical events and academic analysis, you need context. You need to explain what the picture is about. But if you explain too much, you will destroy the photo. Right? You lose the photographic component. If there's too little context, then nobody would actually have any idea of the analysis itself. So it is a very, very tricky balance to what degree. And in some cases, in the first exhibitions, there were lots of texts. And they were very, very present next to the photos. In the later version, I changed that. And then the text was below. They were on the boxes. So that they were, in a way, disconnected from the photography, but they were still there, as they mattered. But it allowed a bit more, I think, balance between context and the photography itself. But in Brazil, I was facing a very particular problem. Brazilians don't necessarily know that much about Cyprus. Brazilians don't necessarily know where Cyprus is, for starters. So that was a bit of a bummer and a bit of a challenge for me. So what I did was I built a separate exhibition using authentic historical material on Cyprus to provide more context, which I hadn't done, of course, when I was doing the exhibition in Cyprus, because then you could at least assume some basic knowledge. But this had to be constructed in addition. And this was an idea from one of my Brazilian colleagues, we put a globe there. And that was the most used object in the room. Because people could touch it, of course, I didn't care. I was often there. And they would look at the globe, and I would say, no, a bit more to the left, a bit more to the left. Yeah, you're close, a bit up. And they would find Cyprus. And that would actually be, for me, a great opportunity to talk about them, about the exhibition, but also about the analysis, and also about them as visitors. So that turned out to be a very successful way of providing context. My third lesson learned was the dynamics of entitlement. Who is entitled to speak about Cyprus? I'm not a Cypriot. I did not live through the Cyprus problem. I wasn't there. I was born in 74 already, true, but definitely not part of the conflict. Edward Said has been writing about exile quite a lot, and one of his arguments is that exile provides you with distance, which allows you to analyze better. And in a way, there is a point there to be made. But at the same time, presence, non-exile, presence produces deep knowledge of the context of a particular space. And that, of course, is very hard to acquire. And I had to study quite hard on understanding at least the Cypriot history. But what do you do with these cases? This is a mural from one of the memorials, which is about the missing. Quite a number of Cypriots, about 500 and about 500 Turkish Cypriots and about 1,500 Greek Cypriots went missing in the different conflicts in the 60s and in the 70s. They went really missing. Horrifically, the Greek Cypriot state and a number of other organizations kept the illusion alive that these people were only missing, that they were alive in in Turkish prisons. They were dead. They simply couldn't be found, but they were dead. But the family was trying to find them, being convinced that they were still alive. And this is what this mural is about, carrying the pictures of the missing with them. It is extremely difficult to understand what kind of pain these people went through, looking for family members for decades. Right? This is not just a few years, this is decades. Demanding to know. And slowly but surely, partially thanks to the UN, and what was established was the Committee of the Missing Persons that started to find the bodies and identify them using DNA tools, so that at least the bodies are, at least in some degree, are found and identified, dealing with the family members suffering. But the point is, it's extremely difficult to understand this kind of trauma if you haven't been part of that society. And that is a restriction for me as an analyst. And we found that when analyzing the reception of the exhibition, we found that in a number of cases. Sometimes it was quite gentle and sweet, but there was still a distance between me as analyst and the Cypriot nation, so to speak. Life is what you make of it. Somebody wrote in the guest book, "Thanks for making it clearer for us." I'm not the us, right? The sentence construction produces an outside, which is me. But it's a gentle outside. It's a thank you for helping us. But I'm still, in a way, outside that us. A more harsher version was the accusation of another photographer in a radio broadcast about the exhibition, when he was basically accusing me of colonialism, which was sort of not very pleasant, I must confess. It is, as he said, it is as somebody saying, "Hey guys, your monuments are rusty, we need someone to fix them up." This makes me feel awkward, as if we're being examined by our colonialists. Now, just for the record, Cyprus was colonized by the British, not by the Belgians. I'm innocent. Belgians did a lot of other things that were horrible. Think about the Congo. But not in Cyprus, right? Not in Cyprus. But still, I'm included in this idea of being a colonizer, which is deeply problematic. And it denies my right to analyze a Cypriot practice of memorialization. But it is a problem in how to navigate these political environments at the same time. So, to wrap up completely now, what do we get out of these projects? Well, some have argued repeatedly that we should organize knowledge transfer. We should move outside the ivory tower. In many cases, that's a deeply problematic discourse, because it means that we should stop being academics, which is something we need to be careful with, I think. Others have argued, in response to that, let's move outside of the ivory tower, have argued, let's stay in our offices, let's write books that few people will read, because that will actually make us relevant. I disagree with that half. I do agree that we need to maintain control over how we communicate with an outside world. That is part of the academic remit. That is key to us. But we shouldn't stay in our offices. I think that's sort of tricky. So what we need is this combination of creativity and control. We need to still be responsible for the knowledge we produce. That is our role, the role of academia in society. But we can do it through the written text, which is creative in its own right. But maybe we can open up spaces for different ways of communicating, for different ways of being creative in transferring knowledge in society. And that's my talk. We still have a few moments for questions, even like 20 minutes. So I'll lock the door, right? And I'll open it after 5 good questions. No pressure. More seriously, any questions? Anything you want to raise, discuss?
This is a question. Why Brazil? Why specifically Brazil? One place where you moved your exhibition from Cyprus?
There is a very simple, practical answer, because they asked. But that's half the answer. I have been working with colleagues from the University of Brasilia. They were very interested in this exhibition because it's about nationalism. And this was right before the Brazilian presidential elections. So it did sort of ring a lot of bells for them. And they got even more interested when I was building it, because then they saw all the connections and they could understand how, because that's what the exhibition is also about, how destructive these forces of nationalism and antagonism can be. And they saw it actually developing as I was there. I was right before the first round, we were running the exhibition. So it did connect extensively with them. But it's a negotiation. The other reason why they were interested was that they had the gallery. This building, Brasilia is a wonderful city in its architecture because it's, of course, the ultimate modernist city in its architecture. Also the campus, the university campus, has been built using this general design that characterizes the entire city, which also means that they build a large gallery as part of the university. And that's a perfect space for me to work in. So the availability of a gallery space connected to a university was perfect for me. And that also made them interested because they could offer the space. It was actually the Faculty of Architecture that owned that gallery and that, in collaboration with the Faculty of Communication, then sort of became co-organizers of the exhibition. And I'm still very grateful for that, obviously. But it was the availability of space which also mattered tremendously. And now I am actually talking, because I did talk about this in Israel just a few days ago, and they were extremely interested and are actually looking if they can bring that exhibition to Israel, which is obviously also, for the same logics, utterly deeply relevant in the political context. My real answer would be, this is not an exhibition about Cyprus, in a way. This is partially explaining the logics and the dynamics of the Cypriot problem and its memorialization. It's also about a more global dimension of how we remember and how our memory is a struggle, right? How there are constant contestations, how there's a dominant force, and the dominant force is still the logics of war, but also how there are contestations that try to change that try to offer a logics of peace by remembering particular people that were peace activists, by remembering particular events that were not about creating war but solving it. And this permanent struggle is something you find in a lot of spaces all over the world. So I didn't mind going to Brazil for a number of reasons. Nobody minds going to Brazil, I think, but it was relevant to me also academically to go there because of that logics. But thank you, it's a good question.
I have a slight problem with the term of academic knowledge. And I would like to ask you, all the things we saw here, from my point of view, they were more kind of artistic knowledge. And that means for me that you always have also a political statement in it and a political position you think is the right one. And my problem is that I think academic knowledge is not that much about having a political position, but more about describing and having this, and you mentioned that at the end, this from the outside perspective. so that we get a more neutral way to observe things, and not to give the audience always a hint how things should be.
Well, I think first of all I was using academic and artistic research and knowledge as references to particular fields and the procedures used in these fields to generate that knowledge. So that's the starting point of my talk in a way. I would argue that this is the work that I was doing is where the two fields meet. But I would also argue and in a way defend this project from an academic perspective, arguing that it was an analysis. It was showing the logics of memorialization on the basis of an analysis of all the statutes that I could find and actually visited and photographed. But it was very much an academic analysis showing like, okay, this is a dominant way of representing conflict. And that is an academic analysis. It is also trying to show a number of statutes that were very hard to find, but that offer counter-hegemonic forces. And again, I think that is an academic analysis. But I went in, it's a cross-fertilization, so you of course use, it was not a very dry documentary approach. It was, in a way, also bringing in a critical dimension. But I think that also academics are entitled to bring in that critical dimension. There is a tradition in academia for critical research. Right? It is one of our paradigms in communication studies, and we can use that. And I think partially I was, in a number of cases, I was using that to show the destructiveness of that dominant discourse of war. You can call that a political intervention. I think in critical theory it will be called a normative position, which is basically the same thing. We agree. But it is I think it is still an academic practice. It is still something we do in academia. But I do get your point in the sense that these two fields start to overlap, and some of the visual elements of the artistic do come in. And then, to totally take a different perspective and in a way support what you're saying, the way the exhibition was received was very political. It became totally politicized because everything on the Cyprus problem in Cyprus becomes politicized. So my intervention was all of a sudden being positioned not as academic analysis, but as a political statement about the Cyprus problem from an outsider that basically doesn't know anything about Cyprus, that kind of discourse. So in the end, the reception was extremely difficult to avoid. It became a political reception. So, and then, yeah, so I side with you on that one for sure. It's a very difficult problem to avoid, though, there especially.
And may I ask how this kind of project is, like, in general received by the normal academic community? Because from the point of Czech Republic, like here we have like really strong movement for the purist science, like ever, and even if you are like publishing in Czech language, if you're in your native language and you are not aiming at like high impact journals, you are not scientist at all. And so I can imagine like if you bring art-based research project and present it in front of this kind of like these science purists or racists or what is it, like how it would be received. Like, so what was the response from the hardcore research community?
There are a couple of answers, but to answer your question, one of the, I think the best, because I have done a number of presentations, mostly on the Mirror Palace of Democracy, because then I can basically talk about my own experiments, which feeds my ego wonderfully. One of the responses that I still remember was actually from Nick Jankowski. And he said, like, this is brilliant, but it also shows that it's not for everybody to do this. And I think that was I was very happy with that comment, because I think that was a very clever thing to say. On the one hand, we should acknowledge the limits that we have. Not everybody can do everything in academia or in the arts world. But there was also a willingness to think with me and to go on that trajectory. It is still part of a struggle in opening up academia for these different practices. One argument, which is a structural reception, One argument is that in the 3 universities where I'm involved, here, but also Uppsala and Brussels, the databases allow for the registration of these projects. And this sounds like a silly thing to say, but it's not. A lot of the things we do are, of course, measured, counted. And if it's not counted, it even exists less. But at least in all 3 universities, there have been efforts to acknowledge the existence of these kind of projects, which is already a lot, I think. But it's a very sort of long route to take. Structurally, I would argue that it's actually not an either-or situation. I think that if we all stop writing, we would shoot ourselves in the foot. And I think that we have to still do the very traditional academic research, high-quality writing. It matters tremendously. And we should not give up. But I would also argue that some experiments and some additions, also in creating more hybrid identities, which I've called the AAA model, right, where we can be academics, but also artists and also activists in different configurations. It doesn't mean that we stop being an academic, it simply means we take on hybrid identities. And sometimes we can be one. We can be the academic, or we can be the artist, or we can be the activist. And that, I think, is perfectly legitimate, as long as we're clear about our positions. Otherwise, we go into the problem that you raised, the political nature that puts us outside of academia. But that hybrid identity matters, and that is still something that we need to fight for, I think. And then the last point there is that a lot of the critiques you mentioned are particularly launched against the humanities. Right? And this struggle is not only about using arts-based research, this struggle is also between the sciences and the humanities, where a lot of the sciences, I've seen that sort of all over Europe and all over the world, where the sciences simply discredit the humanities as being irrelevant and non-scientific anyhow, whatever they do. And sort of moving outside this struggle is, I think, quite important. I think we simply need to acknowledge that there are many different ways of doing academic work. And the struggle between the humanities and the sciences is part of the need for that acknowledgement that humanities also have a reason for existence, and we should not just all become mathematicians. So, yeah, it's a complicated situation, but I think that things are slowly changing and there is some degree of acknowledgement, but it's not full acknowledgement in all cases. But thanks for that question. I should look at the audience. Did I say 5 questions before I unlock the door? I think I should thank you for coming here. This is a welcoming lecture, right? And it's good to see all of you because it makes me feel welcome. So thank you for that. And thank you for the brilliant discussion and for the patience and for dealing with the narcissistic, ego-driven videos and all these things. But also simply thank you for being here. Thanks. Now that we stopped, one quick addition. There's another welcoming talk tomorrow, and I think that's at 5 o'clock, right?
In the afternoon.
So.